Tonight's Torah portion is towards the end of the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is quite an important one. It's the beginning of the Torah, and it really sets the tone for the entire Torah and for the entire history of the Jewish people. We're nearing the end, which is the story of Joseph and his brothers, the 12 tribes and their sister Dinah. And it comes to kind of its climax in this week's Torah portion. Just to recap where we're holding at the end of last week's Torah portion, or to recap even before then, the 12 brothers, Joseph being second to youngest, was not really loved by his brothers, to say the least. And at age 17, he was sold by his brothers. He was sold by his brothers into slavery. 22 years pass of him being enslaved in Egypt, and one thing leads to another, and he becomes the viceroy of Egypt. After becoming viceroy of Egypt, he becomes the viceroy in Egypt, and he becomes a viceroy in Egypt because he is the idealist behind the idea of saving the world, or that area of the world, from the 7 years of famine. There was going to be 7 years of plenty, which he explained, he interpreted in Pharaoh's dreams, followed by 7 years of famine. And so he told Pharaoh that he'd like to propose an idea that they save all the extra grain, the surplus that happens in the 7 years of plenty, and they should save it in storehouses, and then they will have enough food for the 7 years of plenty. And so he does exactly that. They go through the 7 years of plenty, and then the years of famine begin, and his brothers need some food. So they come down to Egypt, and they enter Egypt not knowing that the viceroy is actually Joseph. And so they face Joseph. They're brought to the palace. They don't know why. And they are face to face with someone that they don't know is their brother, but their brother knows it's them. Joseph, being just 17 when he leaves home, he recognizes his older brothers, but the older brothers do not recognize him. He now is a full-grown man. 22 years later, he has a beard, and he's also the viceroy, so there's that fear, intimidation factor involved. And they start this go-between where Joseph decides that he's not going to reveal himself to his brothers. He's going to put them through a series of trials to see if they have repented from their ways, and if they have actually regretted what they have done to him, and they sold him. And so they come to him and they say, we need food. And he says, well, I'm not going to give it to you. Tell me about your family. Well, we have a father, we have this brother that we lost, and then we have the little brother who's still home with our parents. He says, okay, I'm going to take one of you and put him in captivity until you bring me from Israel your little brother. They go back. Jacob is not forthcoming with sending Benjamin. And finally, after a few months, they need more food. And Jacob finally sends Benjamin to, down to Egypt. And so they send him down to Egypt, and he's sad. He's not happy about it. And then finally, Joseph decides to put his goblet, his special goblet through which he gives magic, does all sorts of magic, or supposedly, and he puts it in Benjamin's sack as he returns to Israel with the food. And he returns to, they find the cup in the sack, and they go to, they're returned back to Egypt, and they're now face to face with Joseph, who says, the viceroy of Egypt, they don't know it's Joseph. And Joseph says, I'm going to take Benjamin as a slave. And this is where this week's Torah portion begins, where they're face to face with Joseph, and Judah starts getting all tough with him. And Judah tells Joseph, I am not leaving you. Take me instead of Benjamin. And that way, Benjamin will go home, and I will take Benjamin's place as a slave. And that's where we begin in text 1a, in the beginning of this week's Torah portion. Then Judah approached him, Joseph, and said, "Please, my lord, let now your servant speak something into my lord's ears, and let not your wrath be kindled against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh." And the commentaries explain that he didn't just talk to him nicely, he's the viceroy, and Judah is a subject, as a servant, but he says, "And let not your wrath be kindled." In other words, he says, from here, says Rashi, our favorite commentary, you learn that he spoke to him harshly. He was speaking really tough to him. And what does he tell him? He goes through a whole back and forth, and he tells him the entire situation of what led up to this point. My lord Joseph asks his servant, saying, "Have you a father or brother?" And we said to my lord, "We have an old father and a young child of his old age, and his brother is dead. And he left us alone of his mother, and his father loves him. And you said to your servants, bring him down to me, and I will set my eye upon him." And we said to my lord, "The boy Benjamin cannot leave his father Jacob, for if he leaves his father, he will die." So now, and he goes on and on and on, and 10 verses later, he concludes his speech, and he says, "So now, please let your servant, me, Judah, stay instead of the boy Benjamin as a slave to my lord Joseph, and may the boy go up with his brothers. For how will I go up to my father if the boy is not with me? Let me not see the misery that will befall my father. My father's going to go through this tremendous amount of pain. He's already gone through this tremendous amount of pain. Please don't make me do it again. Don't make my father go through this pain." And what happens after this discussion? Joseph is so overcome and overwhelmed with emotion how he sees his brothers finally caring for another brother. And he sees his brother Judah, he sees clearly that they've regretted their past and that they're now going to put their life on the line for their little brothers. He cannot hold himself back. And this is what happens. Now Joseph could not bear, text 3, all those who standing beside him. And he called out, "Take everyone away from me." So no one stood with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept out loud. So the Egyptians heard, and the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him because they were startled by his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come closer to me." And they drew closer. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." And there's a question that jumps out at us reading these verses. Judah just finished his passion plea quite toughly, explaining how he cannot leave Benjamin behind because his father will not bear it. And therefore he should be in his place. And his father didn't want to send Benjamin in the first place. And his father and his father and his father, he mentioned his father 15 times in that conversation. 5 minutes later, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And what does he say? "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" What do you mean, Joseph, is my father still alive? You know your father's still alive. He just spoke about your father for 10 minutes. Judah just spoke about Jacob for 10, 20, 30, a half hour, however long he spoke to Judah for, however long Judah spoke to Joseph for. So why is he saying over here, "Is my father still alive?" And as it's put by Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi, a great 13th century sage who asks this exact question. One can ask, why does Joseph ask, "Is my father still alive?" If already prior to revealing himself to his brothers, he had inquired after their father's welfare, so he obviously knew Jacob was still alive. So why does Joseph, the first question he asks, "I am Joseph, is my father still alive?" Of course he's still alive. Which means that this idea of Joseph asking, "Is my father still alive?" there's more than meets the eye. It's not just an innocent question, "Is my father still alive?" trying to gather information, but there's something deeper about that question. So we'll explore the first answer as presented by Rabbi Dan Yitzchak Abarbanel, the famous Abarbanel, whom we've quoted a number of times in the past, the great Spanish sage in the late 15th century who was there at the expulsion. He was a court Jew of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, and he actually attempted to save the Jewish people, but to no avail. He was given the opportunity, if I remember correctly, he was given the opportunity to stay behind being a member of the court, and he refused, saying that he's going with his people. Later settled in Constantinople in Turkey with the exiled Jewish community there. And so in his commentary on the Torah, he writes as follows: why does Joseph ask, is my father still alive, if he knew the answer to that question? Text 5, page 155. This then is the reason Joseph asked, is my father still alive? He wasn't actually determining whether or not their father was still alive, for they already said so. To which he had already responded, how is your elderly father faring? Earlier in that conversation. Rather, Joseph was trying to enter into conversation, as he knew his brothers would be ashamed and would not wish to discuss the sale of him when he was 17, the fact that they sold him as a slave. That's the elephant in the room, and he knew that they're not going to want to discuss it. So he opted, continues the Abarbanel, to discuss other matters, choosing to start with their father's welfare. Joseph intended to thereafter inquire after their families and household matters, but refrained from doing so when he saw how shocked they were. Technical. Joseph wanted a question, kind of a conversation starter. And so he asked, is my father still alive? He knew the answer. He just spoke about it, but he wanted a conversation starter. And we find this idea, asking questions that we know the answer to already, as a conversation starter in various areas. Chief among them, text 5, text 6a, in the story of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve just finished eating from the tree of knowledge that they were told by God not to. And they go and they hide. They hide from God. God is all-knowing. He knew where they were. But how does God speak to them? And the Lord God called to man, and he said to him, where are you? Why was he asking, where are you? He knew where they were. Our favorite commentary, Rashi, text 6b, explains. Where are you? He knew where he was. But God asked him this to enter into conversation with Adam, lest he be frightened to answer if God should punish him suddenly. So with Cain, we find that God said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And God knew the answer before he asked the question. And so with Balaam, who are these men with you? And God already knew who the men were, for the purpose of entering a conversation with them. That's why God asked these questions. And so too over here, we can say the reason why he asked, is our father still alive? Wasn't because he didn't know the answer to the question, which he obviously did, but rather it was a way to kind of ease the tension in the room and begin a nice conversation about, almost like the elevator pitch of how's the weather, and talk about the weather in the elevator in uncomfortable, awkward situations. Here was Joseph trying to make the tense situation, or what was about to unfold, and the elephant in the room, the fact that they sold him as a slave and he's now this powerful viceroy that can do anything in return, he tried to ease that tension in the room. Now, this seems like a plausible explanation, but ultimately it's unlikely for a very simple reason. There are so many conversation starters for that conversation. Did he have to choose the least logical one? Asking about, is my father still alive, when his father was literally just discussed like 20 times? The fact that he said this and he said that, and he's going to say this, and he's going to be like this, and he's going to feel this. Literally, that's all Judah spoke about leading up to this moment, was about his father being alive. So if you wanted a conversation starter, he could have easily started with, are you guys married? How many children do you have? What are your children's names? I don't know. How much did you pay for your house? What's the weather like up in Israel now? It's been 22 years since I've been there. Is, my good old buddy who we were kids in school together, is he still around? Does he still, look a little funny? Whatever conversation he could have began. Out of all questions, he had to ask the least logical one, the one that really doesn't fit in. Which leads us to a second interpretation of these words. In Hebrew, when you have a question with a hey preceding it, the Hebrew letter hey, that transforms into the question of being a question seeking for information to an exclamation of wonderment. And that's what Joseph was saying here. What does Joseph say? I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? In other words, how can it be that my father is still alive? It was expressing his astonishment on how is it even possible that my father is still alive? Why is that such an astonishing question? He was a young man relatively to his parents or grandfather at the time. Abraham passed away at 175. Isaac passed away at, I forget exactly how old he was. I believe he was 170. I don't recall at the moment off the top of my head. And Jacob was only 130 at the time, only. Relatively, he was much younger than his father and grandfather were when they passed. So why is Joseph so surprised that their father's still alive? He's not asking a question, is he still alive? He's asking, how can it be? It's an expression of astonishment. How can it be that he's still alive? Why is he astonished that his father is still alive? And that's the first thing that he says. So let's take a step back to when the brothers sold Joseph. They sold Joseph. Now they have to break the news to their father. So what do? They take Joseph's special coat. They dip it into the blood of a goat. And they bring it to Jacob. Jacob looks at it and he says, this is the coat of my son Joseph. A wild animal must have devoured him. And he starts crying and he starts mourning his son, grieving for his son. Text 7a. And all his sons, says the verse, and all his daughters arose to console him, but he refused to be consoled. For 22 years until he ultimately met Joseph, he refused to be consoled. Why? Why did he refuse to be consoled? God forbid a person should never know the pain of losing a child, of losing a loved one. But there is a mourning period, according to Jewish law, the 7-day period, the 30-day period, the 11 months, the 12 months. And then slowly the grieving eases up a little bit. Why did Jacob refuse to ease up on that grieving? Text 7b, back to Rashi, explains something powerful. He refused to be consoled. No one accepts consolation for a person who is really alive, but believed to be dead. For it is decreed that a dead person should be forgotten from the heart, but not a living person. Rashi is teaching us something important. This idea of consolation, this idea of being consoled over the loss of a loved one is something which is given to us from the divine. That one is able to ease up on their grieving as time passes. Not so with a loved one that's still alive that one thinks is dead. The divine does not enable that person to ease up on the grieving. Psychologically, we can say, perhaps, that there's no closure. Jacob didn't see the body. There was no closure. There's no certainty. He saw a bloodied coat, but he didn't have that closure. And so for 22 years, the pain was raw. For 22 years, that grieving pain for his most beloved son was raw pain. Day in, day out, morning, afternoon, evening, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, family parties, birthday parties, anniversaries, It made no difference. The pain of losing his son was front and center. And so Joseph here, hearing from his brothers, revealing himself that I am Joseph, the first thing that came to mind, he was so connected with his father, the first thing that came to mind was, how is it even physically possible that our father, who's been grieving over me for 22 years because I am still alive? And so that grief was raw, was real, and would never eased up. How can it physically be? How is it physically possible for him to still be alive? And that led into his next statement, which was, hurry, don't waste a second, don't study Torah on the way, don't get involved in conversations of who was right and who was wrong by selling me. He continues in the subsequent verses, he says, hurry and go to my father and tell him that I'm alive, so you can take him out of his misery. So you can remove that pain that he's been having for this 22 years. Do it, and do it quickly. Because every second is precious. And so now we understand why the first thing that he says when he's revealing himself to his brother is my father still alive? Because what he's saying is, it's not, is my father still alive? It's an expression of wonderment. How is it even possible that he's still alive after so much suffering? And therefore, go quickly back to let him know, to relieve Yaakov's pain. Which leads us to a second point. And that is, there's another way of understanding this question that he asks, is my father still alive? Until now, we've been discussing Josep's view of the situation, his side of the story, his question, his answers, why he said what he did. But let's read the room a little bit. Here's this brothers. They're standing before the most powerful man, or second to most powerful man in the world. Joseph can blink and they'll all be dead. The entire Egypt works on his command. Egypt being a superpower of the time, Joseph being the viceroy of Egypt, he could do whatever he wanted. And they know that 22 years earlier, they sold him as a slave, and he definitely has it in for them. They're shaking, literally. They're shocked. They don't know how to respond. They don't know what to say. They move backward when he says, I am Joseph, your brother. The shock that sets in, the fear that sets in. This fear that set in caused the following scenario. Text 8, quote from the Talmud. When Rabbi Elazar reached this verse, he cried. The verse says, and his brethren could not answer him, for they were affrighted at his presence. Right? He says, I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? And they couldn't answer because they were terribly afraid. They were shocked. They were afraid of Joseph. And Rabbi Elazar, why did he cry when he read this verse? Because Rabbi Elazar said, if the rebuke of a man of flesh and blood was such that the brothers were unable to respond, when it comes to the rebuke of the Holy One, blessed be he, all the more so. And all the commentaries ask the same question. What's Rabbi Elazar talking about? What rebuke? Joseph said 6 words. He says, I'm your brother Joseph. Is our father still alive? You hear a rebuke in those words? Where's the rebuke that Rabbi Elazar is talking about? But he says he's crying about the rebuke, that the brothers were shocked. There was no rebuke. And so one of the commentaries presents the following interpretation, explanation, which sheds light on the story and also gives us a very powerful lesson. Text 9. This being startled was a mixture of astonishment and fear. For when Joseph said, I am Joseph, they feared revenge, as if he were saying, how could my father be alive after all the pain you caused him by selling me? In other words, what Joseph was saying now was a veiled rebuke. Joseph is telling his brothers, you just gave Judah, you just gave me a whole speech that you don't want to cause pain to your father, because if Benjamin's going to stay here, it's going to cause pain to your father, and a pain to your father, and pain to your father, a whole speech about pain to your father. For 22 years, paining my father didn't bother you. For 22 years, the suffering, the pain of the live grieving over his most beloved son that you caused. Look at the pain and the suffering you put our father through. That's what Joseph was saying in his statement. He's saying, I am Joseph. How can it be that our father is still alive after all the pain that you caused him? And that's why Rabbi Elazar would weep. Because there's no rebuke that stings harder than this type that was given by Joseph. It was delivered with tears, without animosity. It was pointing to the pain that someone's misdeeds had caused to someone that they loved. Caused to others, not just others, but their father, someone that we love most. That was the greatest rebuke that Joseph could have given to his brothers. And that's why Rabbi Elazar would weep when he read these words, because he would recall how we too were in a loving relationship with the Almighty, with our Father in heaven. And as such, how shameful and painful it is to realize that we have caused pain to our own Father with our sins. That's the most powerful rebuke someone can give. And that's the rebuke that Joseph gave. Analyzing Joseph's rebuke a little bit further, leads us to another point. And that is about criticism and rebuke. What Joseph did to his brothers is not just something that he ought to do to his brothers. As a matter of fact, there's a mitzvah. One of the 613 commandments is to give rebuke to someone who's doing something wrong. And we know it in our relationships, we know it in society, we know it at work. Constructive criticism. Right? There are times when criticism is necessary. There are times when being tough is necessary. But Joseph teaches us a powerful lesson. Joseph teaches us how to give rebuke. And how is that? Says the Talmud, text 10, page 159. Rabbi Tarfon says, I would be surprised if there is anyone in this generation who can receive rebuke. Why? Because if the one rebuking says to him, remove the splinter from between your eyes, in other words, rid yourself of a minor infraction, the other says to him, remove the beam from between your eyes. In other words, you have committed far more severe sins. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, I would be surprised if there is anyone in this generation who knows how to rebuke correctly without embarrassing the person he is rebuking. What does that mean? There are two major components to consider when one would like to give over effective rebuke, constructive rebuke. That should be as effective as possible. The first one is the intent of the person rebuking, what's going on inside the speaker. It has to be from a place of love. It has to be from a place of goodness and kindness. It has to be from an honest feeling of, I want to help this person. Joseph did just that. Here he is facing his brother. He went through these few months of giving them a tough time. bringing them to the verge of collapse. But every so often he had to leave the room and burst out crying. He'd wipe his face and he'd go back to giving his brothers the test to see if they've actually regretted of what they've done. He did it with love, with caring concern for his brothers, but he wanted to make sure that the message hit home. So he did it from a good place. Then comes the second point, is how it is delivered. How is the rebuke delivered? Is it done suddenly? Is it done in a tough manner? Is it done in a mean manner? Or is it with a nice tone of voice? Or is it done at the right time in an effective way? And so the Torah tells us that Joseph knew exactly how to give rebuke. Following his revelation, saying, I am your brother, is our father still alive, which was a veiled rebuke, he continues. Text 11a. Then Joseph said to his brothers, please, right? They moved back. He said, I'm Joseph, your brother, is our father still alive? And they moved back. They were afraid. They were shocked. They were shivering. So Joseph said to him, he calmed his tone of voice and he said, please come closer to me. And they drew closer. And he said, I am your brother Joseph. And he mentions the elephant in the room, whom you sold into Egypt. And immediately, but now do not be sad, and let it not trouble you that you sold me here. For it was to preserve life that God sent me before you. Many, many commentaries point to this passage and they explain how the choice of words demonstrate Yosef's sensitivity to his brothers. What did he say? Says the Torah, the famed 14th century sage. He now changed his demeanor and spoke to them in a friendly manner to draw them close. Geshuna Eli, please come closer to me, in a nice tone. And what did he tell them? What were the 2 points that he mentioned in those 2 verses? Text 11c. I am your brother Joseph, he says. The reason he repeated the fact that he was Joseph a second time, right? He began 30 seconds ago. He said, I'm your brother Joseph who sold you to Egypt. Well, I'm your brother Joseph. Is our father still alive? And they jump back. So he says, please come closer. I'm your brother Joseph. What's he repeating it? He just said it. The reason he repeated explains the Or HaChaim, 17th century sage. The reason he repeated the fact that he was Joseph a second time was because he felt that there were 2 possible reasons why the brothers could not respond to him. One, they were afraid of him and could not answer him, just as a thief cannot answer when caught red-handed. The elephant in the room, the fact that they sold him to Egypt. And secondly, they simply did not believe him when he claimed to be Joseph. Who's this guy saying he's Joseph? Maybe he's not. So to dispel their fear of him, he stressed the words, your brother, in the statements. In the next sentence, after he had formed the impression that they did not believe him, he stressed the words, your brother whom you sold, indicating that even at the time they had sold him, he had not ceased feeling like a brother toward them. And he added the words, whom you sold to Egypt, as proof that it was really him, Joseph, for not even a prophet could have known that fact. In other words, that's a fact that no one knew about. Just the brothers and Joseph. No one else knew about it. And so it must be him. They were the only ones that were there at the time. And they didn't talk about it. They didn't tell anyone. And no one told anyone. And so this deeper interpretation into the words offers insight into Yosef's precision and his sensitivity to his brothers. He considered what they were feeling, the fact that they're feeling fearful and uncertain, and he addressed their fear. Yes, you're the ones who sold me into Egypt. I'm that brother, but I'm your brother. Even at the time that you sold me to Egypt, 22 years ago, I never lost that feeling of being your brother. And so, yes, Ha'oid avichai, is my father still alive, was a rebuke to them. How can it be that you caused so much pain to our father? Think about the pain that you caused to him. It was a rebuke, but he went to ease their pain, to make them feel comfortable. I'm Joseph, your brother. They were shocked by his presence. They were fearful. They ashamed. And once he shifted from being stern to a softer approach, he put them at ease and he addressed any concerns they may have had about their relationship. Says Joseph, no, I'm still your brother. I still love you as a brother. I still care for you as a brother. And that I'm here in Egypt, don't worry about it. It was because God wanted that to happen. And this is in line with the general approach of the Torah when it comes to rebuke and when it comes to dealing with others' criticism and so on. The general theme is, as it says in the Talmud, the sages taught it should always be the left weaker hand that pushes another away and the right stronger hand that draws one near. Right? The right hand is traditionally the stronger hand. Some people are lefties, but most people are righties. And the Torah generally, when it speaks about the stronger hand, it calls it the right hand. Interestingly, someone who is a lefty, their left hand is called their right hand in the Torah, in the Jewish law. In other words, you're supposed to put your tefillin on, for example, on the weaker arm. The weaker arm is called the left arm, even if it's one's right arm, their right arm is called the weaker arm. And so it's called the left arm. But either way, the idea over here is that when it comes to pushing someone away, when it comes to giving criticism, when it comes to being tough with other people, discipline, whatever it may be, a parent to a child, friends, spouses, there are some times when we need to give some criticism, constructive criticism. We need to work on things together. That always should be with the weaker hand, that should be with the less focus. The sages are telling us that the dominant feature in one's instructions should be kindness, and one's interactions should be kindness, especially for educational purposes. Teacher, any person in the educational system, a parent to a child, the dominant feature in one's interactions always must be the right, the stronger hand that draws one near. There are times when it's necessary to adopt harsher measures. There are times when it's necessary to give criticism, but that criticism always has to come from the weaker hand. We have to think twice and 3 times and 100 times. Introspection, before we do the act of criticism, before we do the act of discipline. Is this coming from a good place? Is this coming from a place of loving kindness? Is this coming from a place of care, or is it a knee-jerk reaction? Is it coming from a place because I love the other person and I want to help them, and so I want to give them this bit of constructive criticism? Like Joseph did to his brothers, he did it from love, from kindness, from care and concern, or is it coming from a not good place? We always have to make sure, yes, it's necessary, yes, it's justified, but we have to make sure to look inward and check our motivation and determine, is this for the other person's benefit, or is it just my instinctive desire to set the record straight? As the Rebbe writes, the teachings of Chassidut demand that before rebuking someone else, one should cut their nails so that people will not scratch each other or stab each other. For the forces of klipa, negative energy, cling to the nails. Every prick unleashes negative energy, klipa, and other such negative energy. Sometimes it's necessary to use a tough hand. Sometimes it's necessary to rebuke. But on the tough hand, we got to make sure the nails are not sharp. In other words, figuratively speaking, what's the idea? To make sure there's no edge. It's not done with animosity. It's not done with hatred. It's not done with sharpness. It's done with a dullness. It's done with a weaker hand. It's done, yes, it's necessary sometimes. Rebuke, discipline, criticism, whatever it may be. But it has to be with the weak hand. It has to be without the nails. It has to be without the edge, the animosity. Because that's where the negative energy is. That's where the evil forces lie. And if it comes with that edge, it's automatically wrong. And so this is what the story of Joseph teaches us. That in all relationships with people, yes, sometimes it's necessary to deliver an amount of criticism or discipline, but the manner in which it's delivered, the tone of voice, the attitude, and most important, the balance between criticism and warmth are vital. And it's important to remember a further point, which we see by Joseph as well, that as soon as the instructional point is made, as soon as that act of criticism is made, as soon as that's done, immediately move into a mode of closeness. That's it. You did your job. You gave, in Yiddish we say, du hast schon abgesagt dein Pismen. You said what you have to, now move right back to a form of closeness. Move right back to the form of warmth, just like Joseph did with his brothers. Right away, he moved into a form of closeness. He gave them their rebuke, and I said, don't worry. This is what God wanted. He wanted me here. Now go back to your father, and here's the gifts and gifts to my father. Which brings to mind a powerful story that I'm going to share it. It'll take me a minute to pull it up on YouTube. I'm going to share it the way it was shared by the, how do you say the word, protagonist of the story himself. And he's a Dr. Herman, this one's for you. He's a fellow doctor from Pittsburgh, Dr. Abraham J. Twersky, who passed away earlier this year. And famous rabbi, a famous doctor. And he has very, very powerful stories. And one story that hits this point home, that as soon as we deliver that point of criticism, we ought to immediately move on with a showing of warmth and of love. Here it is.
Meet Suvi, the magical all-in-one countertop kitchen robot.
Invariably when I look.
All right, here we go.
Invariably, when I lecture about self-esteem, in the question and answer period, somebody's going to get up and say, what can we do to give our children self-esteem? My stock answer is, it's contagious. Right? If parents will have good self-confidence, a good self-esteem, the children will pick it up. If parents go around feeling failures, insecure, the children will pick that up. So the first thing I say is, work on your own self-esteem. And then there are techniques about how to help children develop self-esteem. You can't give it to them, but you can make it possible for them. For example, we have to discipline children. Otherwise, they grow up to be wild animals, right? But you can discipline them without hurting them, right? And giving them an opportunity to feel good about themselves. I have a beautiful little story about that, right? What happened was, when I was a 10-year-old, I was a chess champion, and I could beat anybody. Well, we had a rabbi staying with us for Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah afternoon, he comes up to me and says, you want to play chess? I said, it's Rosh Hashanah. He says, so you're not to play chess on Rosh Hashanah. What's wrong with that? I played 2 games, and I beat him soundly both times. Later that evening, the shamus, the sexton comes over, and he says, the rabbi wants to see you in the study. So I came in. My father was looking in the volume of whatever. And, I stood there waiting to be recognized. And he let me stand there for a while. Then he looks up at me and he said, "You played chess on Rosh Hashanah?" I said, "Yeah, the rabbi said we're allowed to." He didn't say a word. He looked back into his book and that's all. I knew, yes, technically you're allowed to. But Rosh Hashanah is a solemn day. It's not a game day. It's not a day. So I got the message and I stood there waiting to be dismissed. And to be dismissed, he would say, "Geh gesundheit," you can leave. Right? So I'm waiting for that. So he looks up at me and he says, "You beat him?" I said twice, "Geh gesundheit." You see, he had to tell me that he didn't approve of what I did, right? But I was not going to leave the room feeling bad about myself. And that is the trick of good discipline. Discipline your children in a way that you'll correct them and let them know what's wrong and what's right, but don't make them feel that they're bad, even if they did something wrong.
All right.